Steve, welcome to our In Conversation with series. We're very grateful to have you join us. And we all know that you have a long and illustrious career in the world of pensions, but there is an irony in that statement because for all the work that you've done and what you're doing in pensions, it seems we in the industry are not ready to let you retire and enjoy your own pension. And what say you to that?
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, it is ironic. You're absolutely right. I've spent my entire career, really, my life, existence, most people would say, encouraging people to save for retirement. And I've reached an age where I should have retired long ago, and I'm still working. But it's not. I don't think it's because people particularly wanted me around. In fact, people probably don't. It's just that. It's what I do. In the end, it came to be what I did, and I don't see any reason not to do it, just because I've reached something called old. So I'm carrying on. Sorry about that.
No, that's good. We're glad to hear that. And
I think that's the right answer. I think it is the industry feeding back to you to not let you retire, because we all still need you. Your words of wisdom and your thoughts, and here we are, I guess.
Well, I don't know about words of wisdom, but I mean, I still do have strong views. I've always had strong views on this stuff. I mean, the problem I've always had with pensions is that, and finance in general, it's overly complicated. I mean, to the point where almost it's run by a kind of priesthood, if you like, with its own special language, and everyone in the priesthood knows what they're talking about because they all know the language, but everybody else is excluded. It just seems crazy but I have to say that over the years, when you've when I've actually challenged some of the high priests themselves to explain what they mean in just plain language, it turns out that a lot of them can only speak in terms of their own language. So I'm not sure there's a deep understanding even amongst the high priests of pension. So I'm still convinced that there's less to it than meets the eye, and really, if we all just spoke normally, it might be helpful.
That is so true. So true.
I'm sharing one of your cartoons, Steve. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah. And so not only are you a pensions guru, you're also a very talented and dedicated cartoonist. And I read that you hold a special record. I think for being the only person to submit a response to the select committee in the format of a cartoon. So I thought this cartoon was quite a good one to help kick us off. And just to get your thoughts on for individuals within the UK, what about control over their pensions? Do we have enough control?
No, I think it's perverse that if you, wind back a bit with pensions, particularly in the UK. Specifically in the UK, during the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, so 3 decades there, a number of large occupational pension schemes dominated the UK pension scene. Before we had private pensions going out through first to individuals in the late 80s, and then out through auto enrolment to other smaller firms now. But by and large, if you were in a big company, you were in a big company pension scheme, and that's more or less all most people knew about it. But it was quite common, given the amount of money that was put aside for pensions week in, week out, year in, year out, into pensions. It's quite common for people to be accumulating the biggest asset they've got in the world in their pension scheme. But for a lot of ordinary people who were in good company pension schemes, the old final salary schemes back in those days, defined benefit schemes as they're called now, those it wouldn't be unusual for somebody's pension assets to be worth more than the house they're living in, or they were living in. Quite easy for somebody living in a house average price, £300,000 or something like that. Well, probably not. Actually, the average house price is probably less than that even now. It's probably about 200,000. But not unusual at all to have a pension assets worth maybe 500,000 or more. That's less likely to happen now, unfortunately, because we now have the switch to defined contribution has come along with a real genuine reduction in contributions generally by employers, but that's another issue. But it always seemed perverse to me that the biggest asset that millions of Britons had in the world, including even including their house they live in, was their pension, and yet they had no idea where it was invested, no idea how much it was, no idea what control they had over it. And it was just, isn't it odd that you put that much money into a big pile throughout your entire working life and care not a jot about it? If you'd heard that the local council were going to build a motorway right past the front door of your house, you'd have been ill with worry over it, because it's your biggest asset under threat. Whereas essentially some of the legislation was put through in the 80s in particular, essentially putting motorways right past your pension scheme. No one cared. Nobody knows anything about it. And I think that's odd. And if we ever get to the point where everybody appreciates the value of long-term saving and get involved, wouldn't it be useful if those long-term savings could be used by us while we're at work and not just when we reach a stage of our lives when we're old? I think there are a lot of things that could be looked at to make pensions more accessible and give people more control. And that's not to say that things haven't happened, because the stuff that happened in the last 10 years has been pretty good, I think.
Do you think it's also a generation thing as well? Because I've got a couple of friends that their careers were based on thoughts and from their parents, go and get that job because that job will give you a pension and you won't have to worry about anything. And they literally made their career decisions based on something that their parents pushed them into sometimes.
Well, that's not as silly as it sounds, or it wasn't. The thing is, if you were in a good final salary pension scheme, a defined benefit pension scheme, on average, to give a 60th scheme, people used to say, that's the gold standard, a 60th scheme. If you were in one of those, you probably would have paid maybe 5 or 6% as a contribution, your pensionable earnings. In fact, lots of them, you paid nothing. Insurance companies where I tended to work, they used to have non-contributory pension schemes, non-contributory on the part of the employee. So I would have been in a scheme like that. In fact, I was in a couple of schemes like that, first with the Prudential, later with Scottish Life, Royal London, where I paid nothing at all into the pension scheme. The average cost for an employer running, funding a generous benefit like a 60th, year on year, it would be something like 23% of payroll. That's what it would cost. So in effect, 23% of my pay went into a pension every year, and I didn't pay it in. That's an enormous amount of money to put aside year on year. And at the end of 40 years of that, you've got a big pile of money there. There's no question about it.
And you're right that it isn't a silly thing to do.
No, and those schemes were designed not to make it easy for you to chop and change. It was a lifetime deal, really, to be in a pension scheme in those days, until the changes that came in the early 1990s, which made it much more, it protected better the benefits people left behind.
And the trust was there. I was just going to say the trust was there as well. So you didn't, like you said, you didn't have to worry that the council were going to put a motorway outside the house, because if you were in those pension schemes, you knew that they were going to pay out. You knew that you didn't have to worry about anything.
It's a substantial benefit, and it was. There's no reason why a defined contribution scheme today couldn't be just as substantial. In fact, if I'd be honest, I would prefer to be in a defined contribution scheme to a defined benefit scheme, even though I did very well by being in 2 defined benefit schemes in my career. Well, I'm still in my career, but for that part of my career. So I've I think defined contribution, you've got far more control over everything. What you haven't got control of is the exact amount of pension you're going to get. You know, with a defined benefit scheme, you know precisely what you're going to get, based on what your earnings are going to be as you approach your retirement age. It's defined in the scheme. So you're absolutely certain, you know, I'll be earning this much and I'll be getting this percentage of my earnings in those future years as a pension provided by the employer in the scheme. But those certainties that you get as an employee are, the flip side of that, the complete uncertainties that the employer's got. The employer's got no idea what it's actually going to cost to provide that, and they've got no idea what the pension, pound per pound of pension rate is going to be when you finally get to retirement. So they're taking on the twin uncertainties of the investment risk and the longevity risk, the mortality risk. And they've got no idea on that. So they've got all the uncertainties, and the employees in those schemes had all the certainties. Defined contribution schemes the other way around. The employees get all the uncertainties and the employer gets the certainty. They know what they pay in, and that's the end of it. Mm-hmm. If you were having 23% a year paid into your defined contribution scheme, I'd say, broadly speaking, you get the same kind of value out of the end of 40 years of saving like that. And I'd have gone for the DC rather than the DB version if there was a choice. But the problem is that DC schemes, they get a bad name these days because they don't provide such good benefits as these gold standard schemes. Well, they would if the same amount of money was paid into them as used to be paid into the old schemes. I think we need to question now quite why employers are less likely to offer that level of support into defined contribution arrangements that they were into defined benefit arrangements. And I don't think it's entirely the employer's call, because it wasn't really their money they were investing for me. It was money they otherwise would have paid me, but they didn't pay me and put it into the pension instead. It was the salary package I had. So would people these days be prepared to earn 23% less in take-home pay for a bigger pension? I suspect a lot of people wouldn't. And that
I was just going to say, I don't know anyone, and it's not really a topic that's widely discussed amongst family and friends, as to how much are you putting of your salary into, and I don't think it would be touching nearly 23%.
No, I think it's unlikely. Yeah.
And then so in previous years with defined benefit, there was a lack of engagement because it was kind of seemed to be taken care of. Yeah. But I think that the engagement, control and visibility is still a problem now, and making sure that we have got enough in that pot. And I don't know what your thoughts are for ways and methods of trying to encourage more people to put more into their pot.
Well, I'm interested in something that's been going on this last couple of years, this so-called sidecar savings option. I don't know if you've been reading about that. I mean, Nest have done a trial, which sounds interesting. What they're saying, what's being said by a lot of people now, a lot of commentators and some of these think tanks, is that it's all very well people having pension savings, but most people haven't got rainy day savings. This last couple of years has really brought that into sharp focus for some people. Financial advisors will tell you, before you save anything anywhere, you should make sure you've got 3 to 6 months take-home pay from your job stashed away somewhere for rainy day money, just in case. You never know what's around the corner. So the idea, I think, with this sidecar savings thing, which I think has been promoted quite strongly by a lot of people now, and some people are asking the government to even consider adding it as an extra possibility with auto-enrollment, is that you might have certain money coming out which goes into your pension, which all employers are required to do by law now for any workers that have enrolled. Then why not take some more money out of payroll and put it into a savings pot that runs alongside the pension to build up some rainy day money, but it's accessible if you need it. That's the trouble with committing money to savings. And I think that's interesting, but I absolutely don't like the idea of having 2 pots to put it in. That just seems not, if the government come out and say, right, give your employees the chance to have an extra pot for their rainy day money, but if they leave it for a couple of years, it automatically gets invested in the pension because they didn't need it. But if they did need it, they can take it out, and then they keep topping it up again. When it gets to a certain level, it can go in the pension. But if it never goes there, it never gets. Someone's got to run that. Someone's got to split that money in payroll and all that. As fiddly as anything to do. Big requirement for the employers. What I'd rather see, because I think it's a great idea that people have access to rainy day savings. My view would be, why don't we do something really radical? Why don't we make a small but highly significant change to pension legislation and give everyone in a pension scheme with a defined contribution, the right to take back any contributions they've made in the previous 2 years above the auto-enrollment required levels, so that the last contributions you make on a 2-year rolling basis are always accessible, just as though they were in a building society.
A rainy day fund, yeah.
So that would instantly give millions of people access to rainy day savings. It would be the money that they last it contributed towards their long-term savings. Now, anyone listening to this, if this bit isn't cut out of the video because people think it's crazy, right? Anyone listening to this will say, "There he goes again. That's mad. That's ridiculous." I don't think so, right? I think that if you can make the pension product itself more attractive to people, it's much better than saying pensions are okay, but really people need something else as well. Why not make the pension itself, which ought to be a central part of somebody's financial planning, why not make it far more useful to them while they're at work, while they're going through something called everyday life, right? Which, by the way, doesn't stop when you retire, quite the opposite. But it's if you had access to that money, in that way, I think it would encourage people to not overcommit, but commit more towards pension savings in the first place. If you thought, well, actually, I've looked at the numbers, I've spoken to some advisors, I know what I'm looking at here. I'm only saving 5% for my pension. I should really be saving 10. That's really what I ought to be doing. Would you commit to that extra 5%? If the minute you pay it in there, you won't see it again until you're in your, decades later, in your 60s, right? That's a big ask to say, I'm absolutely sure I don't need this money. I'll put it in there and I can't touch it ever again. Much better, I think, to say, well, that's the kind of level of saving I'd like to make. I'll see how it goes. But if I need it, the fact I can take it out again, if I really need it, if the car's on the blink or something like that, then I think that would make pensions more attractive. Now, anyone running a pension scheme listening to this will be screaming at the screen because they'll say, this will make running pensions even more complicated. Yes, but let's be honest, pensions are complicated to run anyway. A bit more complexity won't hurt, will it? And wouldn't it be useful if the industry itself could take on that complexity with the way they structure funds and all those things? Well, I know quite difficult, so that employees could have a simple concept. The last money I paid in, I can pull out for up to 2 years if I need it. Why not? And much less complicated than having a sidecar option or whatever it's called. And employers having to get involved in moving your money about from payroll. So, that's a clumsy way of achieving something that's actually quite simple to do by adapting the pension schemes themselves.
I think it's a fantastic, logical, simple way of moving the industry on and actually making a massive change, ticking lots of boxes at the same time, but not in a pensions typical complicated way. So yeah, I mean, I'd be up for that, definitely. And just going back to the, it makes it hard for pension schemes to cope with that. I think technology's moved on. I mean, we don't want to get into a technology conversation particularly, but technology has moved on, and so have clients and employers and employees. So everyone's moved on from a technology point of view. So and you know, Justine's question at the beginning about control of assets, the end customer, the employee, knows exactly what they've got, and they're in control of their future, alongside the pension scheme, alongside the employer. Yeah, I love it. I love that idea.
Well, there you are then. Let's see if we can get it done.
Yeah, sorted. Done.
You do the white paper and I'll draw some cartoons on it for you.
Brilliant. Brilliant. That's fantastic. Just what do you think about the investment side of things? And you know, not necessarily control, but visibility over the investment element.
I think people should. Well, I don't know why people are not interested in where their pensions money is invested. I've been, over the years, I've been to loads of seminars here, there, and everywhere. I've even chaired some where people, they talk about these sort of institutional funds as being, as if nobody owns them. I listened to some of this stuff over the years, and I think, well, I don't know. These vast amounts of money that are flying around in the pensions markets, they're actually owned bit by bit by Joe and Josephine Average and everybody. But that doesn't come across at all. It's almost as if this is too complicated for you. We're experts. We'll deal with this. I understand why an industry would do that, but because it suits them. And it's lovely for them. I know, but what I really don't understand is why so many millions of people have put up with. It just seems odd to me, perverse, really, that people would think that's okay. There's no other investment you've got that you'd be so disinterested in, I'm sure.
Yeah, I agree. And I know we're focusing on pensions here, but I think that spans the scale of investment generally, doesn't it? Probably. That if you give a client control, and they're engaged in what they're saving for, or whatever the event is that they're investing for, that they're much more engaged and much more in control, which means that they're interested.
Well, we're all engaged in our houses, aren't we? Because we're interested in that. If there was a glimmer of something in one of the news feeds that house prices might be going down, we'd all look. And if our next door neighbour sells for, well, wow, they've got out. We're massively interested in that, in those kind of investments. To the point where we worry about them. Why not with our pensions? I don't know.
It's a sad situation that we find ourselves in, and I think the idea of trying to get the employer taking on more responsibility, I don't know if where does the incentive lie for them to do that?
Yeah, I think within the DC markets, defined contribution schemes, I think there's obviously far more scope there for employees to become involved in their own investment decisions, even within boundaries, if you like. I think that's I think that's the nature of that kind of investment. But going back to what we were talking about earlier with a defined benefit scheme, it's quite literally nothing to do with the employee where it's invested. It's the employer that's taking on that risk because they've made a promise that they're required to keep. So the investment there, I would question quite a lot of the things that were done in the late 80s and early 1990s, where the way that employers were required to fund, the restrictions put on the way that they could fund their long-term DB promises seem to me to put too many restrictions on employers. If they're good, if an employer is good enough to voluntarily run a scheme where they run all the risks, then they should have been given complete control, I think, over the timing of the contributions they made and the amounts. It shouldn't have been seen as a tax dodge to put money into your employees' pension schemes, because it's money that you've pledged to the benefits that you've promised. So I think those unnecessarily, restrictive things that happened then probably had a big part to play in the demise of the DB market, the DB sector here. The pension schemes became more difficult to run, harder to meet your promises if they end up on your balance sheet every year. So I think those things weren't helpful, and I think they didn't properly recognise the voluntary nature of what employers were doing in a situation where, quite frankly, they didn't have to run generous pension schemes. They just simply chose to. And their employees, like you were saying earlier, they bought into that, some of them even going into that career because it came with that kind of benefit in tow. So, there was kind of that mutual arrangement there between employees and employers. You'd get less take-home pay, but you'd have a good amount of pay going into a pension scheme. The employer, though, has got to make those contributions and and top them up with their own if they're not sufficient. So it's the risks they were running should really have been appreciated more, I think, by the legislators at those times.
Steve, I was going, with your idea for the rainy day savings being rolled into pensions. Is there any?
We started something with that now, haven't we?
I know. You've got us into it now. But is there anybody doing anything now today that you think, oh, that's different, or that's
well, it is. I think it is Nest that have been doing that, which made me think, well, that's a good idea. But as usual, I could think of a better way of doing it. But it's I do think emergency savings are another issue. I think what if an absolute disaster hits you? Isn't it odd that you could find yourself in your early 40s, say, and absolutely in a financial predicament, but at the same time have hundreds of thousands of pounds in your pension fund? Mm-hmm. Wouldn't it be good if we could define what we might think such an emergency might be, and say that in those circumstances, or certain restricted circumstances, people would be given access to their pension savings, maybe to borrow from. So you go to a bank to borrow. Why go to a bank when you've got all this money in your pension fund? Why not borrow from yourself, from your own past frugality? Why not borrow and be required to pay that back over certain fixed periods that might be allowed? So once again, you'd be making the pension pot that people have got far more use to them in something called real life, which unfortunately, all the people that are in pension schemes are involved in something called real life at the same time, whereas the people that write the legislation for pension schemes appear never to have been involved in real life. So, if you could get hold of the last 2 years' contributions, like we said earlier, then that would help the rainy day bit, and may even encourage people in general to save more if the industry could big up the benefits of being able to do that. So it's actually worth having a lot of money in your pension because you can borrow more back out of it, that kind of thing. If also the big pile of money that is committed to the pension could itself release funds to help you for your absolute financial emergencies, why not? And that would make you not regret having made those savings there in the past. So I'm all for anything that makes pensions more useful to us during our lives rather than just during the last part of our lives. Why not? It's not like we get a great benefit when we save in a pension. People go on about tax relief. Tax relief with pensions is really generous. It's absolute nonsense. It's not generous at all. What happens with pensions when you save for a pension? You put money into your long-term savings instead of spending it now. So you're deferring your income. You take that money out of your pre-tax earnings and put it into the pension scheme. You only pay tax on it when you finally draw it as income one day when it's a pension. So the income tax is paid just once. You don't pay it on the way in. You pay it when you get the pension money out as income. And that makes a lot of sense to me. So if any chancellor of the Exchequer, whoever they are, said to you, I'll tell you what, I've got a great deal for you here, right? Pensions, long-term savings, right? Here's the deal. You put money in, You get hold of it 50 years later, decades later, and I guarantee you, I'll only tax you once if you do that. So what? Oh, thanks. That's not, come off it. So but that is the deal. That's all the deal is. The deal is that you get taxed once on your long-term savings. There's some good advantages to that, because you get the roll up on the increased savings in the first place, and the magic of compound interest on that roll up is helpful. And you also get a tax-free cash sum at the moment of maybe up to a quarter of that. And that's really worth having, because it means you put tax-free money in and you're going to get some tax-free money out. I'd argue that's the only genuine benefit in the UK long-term savings market, and the only one that we ever did have. The deal is you only get taxed once. Think about the practicalities of that, right? You only get taxed once if you save in the long term for a pension. How can a chancellor or any politician prove that they mean that when they say it to you? What they could say is that, I'll tell you what, pay tax on the way in, like you do with an ISA, for instance, put it into the pension, and I guarantee you won't be taxed in 60 years' time when you draw it out. You'd have to be seriously stupid to believe them, right? Because they've got no control over tax policy 60 years hence. They've got no. The only way you can believe it if someone says that to you is if they let you off on the way in, and you pay tax on the way out. Still a leap of faith. For all you know, the current tax rates, 20% at the lowest at the moment, they might be enormously low compared to what they should be over it. You might be paying 40% on this money when it comes out. So the tax rates in the future are a big unknown and a big risk that you're taking. But at least you'll only pay that income tax once on these savings. So I think people in the UK are very good, really, to invest their money for such a thin promise that they'll only be taxed once on those savings. So, it's a myth that we get tax relief on pensions. We don't. We get tax deferment. We only pay income tax when we get income. Sorry, that was a rant, by the way.
No, love it. Love it. We like rants. We rant all the time, Steve, Justine and I.
So anything we can do to make the pension savings genuinely more useful to people, it has to help too.
So Steve, are you saying that you would rather it be taxed at the start, or just
no, you'll end up being taxed twice if you do that.
Yeah.
Do that. No,
I mean instead of later. Take the promise.
No, I think the EET model. I know this is one of these things that everyone talks about. EET. I used to go to meetings hearing people talking about. I didn't know what they were talking about, but exempt input into a pension scheme. You don't pay tax on the money you put in. Exempt growth in the investments and taxed output is kind of the structure of our pension system. EET. Although the middle E now is E-ish, because you do get taxed a bit. So that's a good investment. EET is that's the best, I think, for long-term savings. That's the best model. It's brilliant that a quarter of that money is EEE. It's exempt investment, exempt input, exempt investment, and exempt output. The tax-free cash, the anachronism that we've still got. Brilliant. That's as good as it gets. If you have something like an ISA, it's TEE, isn't it? It's taxed input, but you get exempt growth and exempt output. And with other building society accounts, you might get TTE, so taxed input, tax investments, and exempt output. The worst thing in the world is something called TTT, right? Where it's your money you put in tax, funds are taxed, and you get taxed on the way out. That's why I'm dead against having any T's at the beginning of that acronym. The best place for the T's is at the end, not the beginning. That's my a bit of wisdom there.
I feel like there's a cartoon that can easily describe that.
I did it once. It was called EET Phone Home. I thought it was funny at the time. I'm not sure it came out that well, but it was interesting. Yeah.
No, that's funny. That is funny. We'll have to find it and use it.
I couldn't find it. I do remember drawing it though, and it was published, but I don't know where.
Brilliant.
So Steve, I'm curious to get your views on pension freedoms then, because that's a little bit of flexibility that's been introduced, although the effects are still, being felt in various forms across the industry. But I'm just curious to get what do you think of it?
Okay. Before it happened, and I would say decades before it happened, I always thought it was a great idea that people should be given control of their own money. It happened, and I thought it was a great idea when it happened. And ever since it's happened, I thought it was a great idea. So I think it might have been sensible to put in some lower level below which you couldn't go. But as long as the people that are taking their pension money and spending it on themselves in other ways, or in a different speed than they otherwise might have spent it, as long as they have sufficient income left that they would never ever call on public resources to support them, then I think it's up to them what they do with their own money and nothing to do with anybody else. And that's the way that should be one of the pillars that underpins our thinking on pensions. If it's somebody else's money and they're not calling on the rest of us to support them, then it's entirely up to them what they do with it. Nothing to do with anybody else. So I think they're a great idea. And I know people say, well, there have been problems with it and this and that, but I think those could have easily been predicted and they could have easily been mitigated. Just because we're not good enough at making the rules up, it doesn't mean it's not a good idea.
It's very true in a lot of circumstances, isn't it? It's there just needs a little bit more thinking beforehand, or during, or
well, there were calls for that for a long time before it happened, and I was one of the people calling for it. And it seems to me that if people have complete control over their own assets, they're more likely to build them up.
Yeah.
It's if you want to get people genuinely interested in pensions, then you've got to make pensions genuinely useful for them, and not so specific. And I can see why pensions are useful for the pensions industry, but I'd like to think that they were far more useful to the people whose money is paying for that.
Totally agree.
It's a funny one, isn't it? Because it's brought that flexibility, but it's also brought some bad headlines with it as well. With British, what was it? The steel company.
British Steel.
Yeah. So it's and then annuities kind of fell off a cliff really, and it seems to be a slow return towards that.
Well, I think the problem with annuities is that the industry has been lazy for decades and so long that they haven't really explained the benefits of the annuity, the insurance. It's an insurance product. If someone said to you, do you want to insure against living longer than your money, you'd probably say, yeah, I'll insure against that. That's essentially what an annuity is. Because it's so caught up in this dopey language we use in this industry, no one knows what you're talking about. Annuities are great products. It's just that we're rubbish at selling them and explaining them. It's not the fault of the people that don't do it. The industry itself is incapable of explaining the benefits of its products.
Totally agree. A big passion of mine is simplicity across the board, really. Simplicity in education. I think people want to know. I think they could have the mechanisms to know, but I think sometimes the industry, whether it's pensions industry, investment industry, or whatever, is the barrier to delivering that, because we like to think, or we like to wallow in the complexities of things because it makes us feel good sometimes. And don't get me started. I'm going to I'll waffle and
but that's exactly what priesthoods are all about.
There you go.
but by and large, the industry we're in is not particularly good at engaging with people, and when it does, they don't understand the bloody word we say anyway. So it's I think this industry needs to be a lot better at understanding what it is it's doing for people and explaining itself. Although having said that, I've been in this industry for 50 years, and I haven't seen it hasn't got enormously better at that over that time.
It sounds like you're carving yourself out yet another few years, Steve.
Well, I'm busy with one thing and another. I just dabble in this now. Yeah.
That's great. Well, one of the kind of final, I don't know if Justine's got any other questions before I ask my final sort of question that I'd really like to know is if, whilst you're sitting there thinking about pensions and what's needed, you had in your drawer a wizard wand, and over the next 5 years before you do suddenly decide that you are going to, kind of grow carrots and be properly retired. I don't know why I said carrots, but anyway.
I've got carrots in the garden at the moment. Don't worry about that.
There you go. See, I must have known that because I can see. So your wizard wand, what would be your prediction or wish for the next 5 years?
I think you've got to be realistic about where we are. We've built auto-enrollment in the last decade and a bit. I think you've got to go with that. People say that this is brilliant now because we've got so many more people saving money in a pension. That's not entirely true. In fact, it's not even true. It's untrue. We've probably got fewer people saving for a pension now than we had a decade ago. We used to have 2 state pensions. For the last 60, 70 years, we've had 2 state pensions until recently, although nobody ever knew anything about it. Nobody knew we had 2 state pensions, but the state second pension was essentially an unfunded a pension scheme run by the government for smaller employers and their staff, funded through national insurance contributions, but not into a fund. So all we've really done is stopped the state second pension, which no one had ever heard of anyway, and replaced it with auto-enrollment, but with the ability for people to opt out if they want to do that, which I think was crazy, by the way, allowing that. So, if just one person opts out, then by definition, we're going to have fewer people saving than we're saving in the non-existent fund for the national insurance. But, we're where we are. We've got auto-enrollment, but I think the government were far too on eggshells about how much money people should put away into their pension. So we've ended up with people on, low earnings, certainly lower than median earnings, with large parts of their earnings excluded from pension contributions, and just tiny contributions going in, and a small percentage as well of their reckonable earnings, or whatever they're called. So I think we're probably giving a lot of people false hope with auto-enrollment, and that we've got people saving for outcomes that at best might be what they would have had anyway from the state second pension, and maybe in some cases won't be that good. I think if you think I've done my pension, I'm in auto-enrollment, that's a dangerous thing to, that's a dangerous delusion to be under. So what I'd like to see is a serious conversation between government, the industry, and the public about the real nature of the pension savings they're involved in, and the low level of contributions, and why that, we ought to have a public debate around how that might be improved. And there's only one improvement you can possibly make that make any real difference, and that is an increase in contribution levels, a much wider band of earnings to be included, and maybe as much as 10, 12, 15% going in for everybody. If you're going to do that, then absolutely everything else we've spoken about in this podcast or whatever, it is entirely valid. People will rail against that if the money is locked away and it's of no earthly use to them until they're very, very old. So if we're going to do anything to make pensions work, we build it on auto-enrollment, we build it on good conversation with people, particularly the people that are benefiting from it, the employees themselves, and make sure that we build a pension product at the center of it that's worth having, and people will look at and say, you know what, it's worth having one of those during your working life. It is helpful to you. You can get money out of it if you need it, and if you hit a disastrous, it would help you then too. And it means that you can relax about your retirement savings with such a low state pension as we have in this country. We don't forget we've got a very poor state pension here. So yeah, that's where I would concentrate my efforts if I was still that active in the industry. I don't lobby anymore, I'm too old for that. People your age should be doing that, not me.
Well, I agree. I think we should. I think everything that you've spoken about today, and joining it all together and just delivering something simple and educational that customers and employees can really make a difference with their pension. And I love the bit about, using the latter years contributions for the emergency fund and making good use of it. I mean, it's a no-brainer really, isn't it?
Yeah, let's see if we can get it done then.
Sorted, we're done. Yeah, perfect. Is there any more from you, Justine?
No, I don't think so. But I think, so for me, there's three things that jump out from today's conversation. One, I think we want to try and somehow increase contributions, hopefully through engagement with the employer. Get a conversation going with the industry, government and the public. And I think a bit more flexibility around where the savings are going and how they can be accessed for emergencies, so that people don't feel like it's locked away and that it's going somewhere that they're not going to see in the future, that they can't imagine just now, but in a way that will help them in their real life day to day.
Actually, if we'd just done that at the beginning, we could have saved a lot of time.
Perfect.
I think that was good. So thanks so much, Steve, for doing this. It's been a real pleasure, and it's lovely to speak to you again.